The stranger in the night. Marcus Turner was a man content with the rhythm of his life, the kind of man who had found peace in simplicity. At 35, he had learned that a modest life held its own kind of wealth, one built not on possessions but on relationships, on acts of service, and on the quiet pride of a job well done. Brooksville, the small town he called home, was a reflection of that simplicity. Nestled between hills and forests, the town moved at a pace that left room for neighborly conversations and unhurried walks down Main Street. Everyone knew everyone, and Marcus was no exception. Don't forget to subscribe. Each day started the same for Marcus. Before dawn, he would rise, put on the same pair of well-worn jeans, and brew himself a strong cup of coffee. The smell filled his modest, single-story home, a house that had been his parents' before it became his, a home filled with memories of simpler times. He'd sit on his porch, watching the sun slowly rise over the oak trees that lined the horizon, its golden light filtering through the morning mist. It was his time to reflect, to gather his thoughts before heading into town to his job as a maintenance technician at the local community center. The people of Brooksville relied on Marcus for more than just fixing leaky faucets or broken doors. He was a fixture of the town, known for his kind heart and willingness to help anyone who needed it, whether it was an elderly neighbor whose roof needed patching or a single mother whose car had broken down. Marcus was there with a smile and a toolbox. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was fulfilling. That Friday evening had been like any other. Marcus had finished his day at the community center, packed up his tools, and headed home along the familiar winding road that led out of town. The sky had begun to turn a soft pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape. The air was crisp, and Marcus enjoyed the peacefulness of the drive, the way the world seemed to quiet down at the end of the day. As he rounded a bend in the road, the flashing hazard lights of a car caught his attention. He slowed his truck and pulled over onto the shoulder. A silver sedan was parked on the side of the road, its rear tire flat. Standing next to it was a woman, her face a picture of frustration and anxiety. Marcus recognized the look immediately, someone stranded and unsure of what to do. Without hesitation, he stepped out of his truck and approached. The woman looked up as he neared, her expression softening with relief. "Hey there," Marcus called out with a smile, his voice calm and reassuring. "Need some help?" The woman nodded, visibly flustered. "Yes, please. I've been here for almost an hour trying to figure this out. I don't even know where to start." Marcus glanced at the scattered tools around the car and the flat tire that had clearly seen better days. "Don't worry. I've got it covered." The woman smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you. I was starting to think no one would stop." "No problem at all," Marcus replied, rolling up his sleeves. He introduced himself. "Marcus Turner. You from around here?" "Sarah," the woman said, pushing a stray lock of blonde hair behind her ear. "Sarah Collins. I actually just moved to Brooksville a few months ago. Still trying to get used to the place." Marcus nodded as he worked, setting the jack under the car and loosening the lug nuts. "Brooksville's a good town. You'll find the people here are pretty welcoming." Sarah shifted uneasily, glancing down the road as if expecting someone or something. It didn't go unnoticed by Marcus, but he kept his focus on the task at hand. People had their reasons for being anxious, and he wasn't one to pry. In a matter of minutes, Marcus had the spare tire in place and tightened. He stood up, wiped his hands on a rag he kept in his truck, and gave the tire a final check. "That should get you home, but I wouldn't go too far on it. These spares aren't made for long distances." Sarah exhaled a sigh of relief, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Thank you, Marcus. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Glad I could help," Marcus said, offering her a warm smile. "Just make sure you get that tire replaced soon." Sarah nodded and reached into her purse, pulling out a small wad of cash. "Here, please take this. It's the least I can do." Marcus glanced at the money and then back at Sarah, shaking his head gently. I can't take that. Helping out someone in need is payment enough." Sarah seemed taken aback. "Are you sure?" "It's not much, but I really appreciate what you've done." "I'm sure," Marcus replied. "Just drive safe and take care of that tire." Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. There was gratitude, certainly, but also something else, something deeper that Marcus couldn't quite place. Finally, she nodded and tucked the money back into her purse. "Thank you again, Marcus. I won't forget this." With a final nod, Marcus stepped back as Sarah climbed into her car. She gave him one last look, her eyes lingering on him as if she wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. Then she started the engine and drove off into the fading light. As Marcus climbed into his truck, he thought about the encounter. It wasn't unusual for him to help someone out. He did it all the time. But there was something about Sarah that felt different. The way she had acted, the way her eyes had darted around nervously, as if she was afraid of something or someone. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than just a flat tire. He shrugged off the thought as he started his truck and headed home. People had their own lives and their own worries, and it wasn't his place to pry. He had done what he always did, helped someone in need. And that was enough. The drive back home was peaceful, the sky darkening as the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the hills. Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing he had made a difference in someone's day. But as he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, a small, nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. There was something about that encounter that didn't sit right, something he couldn't quite shake. Little did Marcus know, his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. And it all started with a simple act of kindness on the side of the road. The SUV in the shadows. The next morning began like any other for Marcus. The soft chirping of birds outside his window signaled the dawn of another day in Brooksville, the quiet hum of a new beginning. He stretched lazily, swinging his legs over the side of his bed, his feet meeting the cool, familiar floor. The routine was so deeply ingrained in him that he didn't have to think about it anymore. Just like his morning cup of coffee, brewed strong and black, as he stood by the kitchen window, gazing out at the peaceful street. It was a ritual that gave Marcus a sense of control over the small, manageable parts of his life. But today, something was different. His eyes caught sight of a sleek, black SUV parked across the street from his house, its dark-tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. The car didn't belong to any of his neighbors, and it certainly wasn't the kind of vehicle you saw often in Brooksville, where practicality trumped style. Marcus narrowed his eyes, curiosity sparking in his mind. The car had no markings or stickers that might explain its presence, no signs of life or movement. It just sat there, like a shadow that had settled on the street overnight. Maybe it was nothing, he told himself. Someone visiting a neighbor, or maybe even a tourist passing through town. But a nagging feeling in his gut told him otherwise. He sipped his coffee, his mind briefly wandering back to the encounter with Sarah the night before. The way she had looked around nervously, the tension in her voice. Could the SUV be connected to her? The thought seemed absurd at first, but the more he considered it, the less he could shake the feeling. Marcus finished his coffee and set the cup down on the counter, trying to push the thought aside. He had a full day ahead of him, and worrying about a strange car wasn't going to get his work done. He grabbed his keys and locked the front door behind him as he stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against his skin. He cast a quick glance at the SUV as he made his way to his truck, but nothing had changed. The vehicle remained still, its windows reflecting the morning light, hiding whoever, or whatever, might be inside. Marcus felt a twinge of unease, but he pushed it down. He was letting his imagination get the best of him. As he started his truck, he glanced once more in the rearview mirror, catching the black SUV still parked across the street. Something about the way it just sat there, unmoving, gave him a sense of unease he couldn't quite put into words. He pulled out of his driveway and headed into town, trying to focus on the day ahead. The drive to the community center was a short one, but today it felt longer. Marcus's mind kept drifting back to the mysterious SUV and Sarah's anxious demeanor from the night before. There was a connection there. He just knew it. But what? Who was Sarah really, and what had made her so nervous? His instincts told him there was more to the story than she had let on. When Marcus arrived at the community center, the building was already buzzing with activity. It was an old brick structure, weathered by time but still standing strong, much like the people it served. The center was a hub of the town, a place where folks gathered for everything from yoga classes to town meetings. Marcus had worked there for nearly a decade, and he took pride in keeping the place running smoothly. His coworker, Jenny, was already at her desk when he walked in, her cheerful face greeting him as always. "Morning, Marcus," she called out, a bright smile on her face. "Morning," Marcus replied, forcing a smile as he tried to shake off the lingering unease from earlier. "Everything all right?" Jenny asked, tilting her head slightly as she noticed his distracted demeanor. "You seem a little off today." Marcus shrugged. "Just a strange morning, that's all. Nothing to worry about." Jenny raised an eyebrow, but didn't press the issue. She was used to Marcus being a man of few words when it came to his personal life. Instead, she handed him a clipboard with the day's tasks. "We've got a few repairs that need your attention," she said, pointing to the list. "The sink in the kitchen is acting up again, and there's a broken door in the gym that needs fixing." "Got it," Marcus said, glancing at the clipboard. It was a routine day, just the way he liked it. He could lose himself in the work, focus on the small, tangible tasks that didn't involve mysterious SUVs or anxious strangers. But as Marcus moved through his day, repairing the sink and fixing the door, the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He couldn't stop thinking about the SUV. By lunchtime, he found himself distracted, his thoughts returning again and again to that black vehicle. Finally, after he finished his last task for the day, Marcus decided to take a break. He grabbed his lunch and stepped outside, seeking a bit of fresh air. As he sat on the steps of the community center, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, surprised to see a message from an unknown number. The text was short and to the point. "Be careful who you help." Marcus stared at the screen, his heart skipping a beat. The words sent a chill down his spine. Who had sent this message, and how did they know about Sarah? He quickly typed back, "Who is this?" but received no response. He tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and more than a little unnerved, Marcus shoved his phone back into his pocket. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, that the black SUV wasn't just a coincidence. When he got back to his truck at the end of the day, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a small, folded piece of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, unfolding the note with a growing sense of dread. "You should have taken the money." The message was cryptic, but Marcus understood its meaning all too well. Whoever had sent the note and the text knew about his encounter with Sarah. But how? And why was it so important that he had refused her money? He scanned the parking lot, half expecting to see the black SUV lurking nearby, but there was no sign of it. Still, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He climbed into his truck, his mind racing as he drove home. His thoughts kept returning to Sarah, the way she had acted, the nervousness in her voice, the sense that she was hiding something. What had he gotten himself into? When Marcus pulled into his driveway, the first thing he noticed was the SUV. It was still parked across the street, just as it had been that morning. Only this time, it felt more menacing, like a predator lying in wait. He swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Steeling himself, Marcus got out of his truck and walked toward his front door, every nerve in his body on high alert. He could feel eyes on him, watching from somewhere inside the SUV, though he couldn't see through the tinted windows. Once inside, Marcus locked the door behind him and peered through the blinds, his heart still racing. The SUV remained parked across the street, unmoving, a silent threat. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt a sense of fear creeping into his normally peaceful world. Something wasn't right. The simple act of helping a stranded woman had spiraled into something much bigger, something darker. And Marcus had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went, or how far these mysterious strangers would go to keep him quiet. As the sun set and darkness fell over Brooksville, Marcus sat in his living room, staring out the window at the black SUV that refused to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Little did Marcus know, the events of the past 2 days were only the beginning, and soon he would learn that sometimes helping a stranger can come with dangerous consequences, shadows, and secrets. Marcus barely slept that night. The image of the black SUV burned into his mind. Its dark, menacing presence lingering across the street from his house, refusing to leave. Each time he tried to close his eyes, his mind replayed the cryptic messages he had received. The mysterious text, the note left under his windshield wiper, and most of all, the warning, "Be careful who you help." It was as if an invisible thread connected the act of kindness he had extended to Sarah with something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Marcus had come to a decision. He couldn't just ignore this. Something was happening, something bigger than a simple flat tire, and he needed answers. As the first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, Marcus made up his mind to track down Sarah. If anyone had answers, it would be her. But first, he needed to see if that black SUV was still parked outside. He crept toward the window, careful not to make too much noise. Peering through the blinds, his heart sank. The SUV was gone. For a moment, he felt a sense of relief wash over him, as if the absence of the vehicle meant the danger had passed. But then his mind raced with questions. Where had it gone? Would it return? Was he still being watched? He forced himself to focus. If he wanted to understand what was going on, he needed to talk to Sarah. He realized with a pang of frustration that he hadn't thought to ask for her phone number the night he helped her. But she had mentioned that she had just moved to Brooksville, and in a small town like this, finding someone wasn't impossible. After a quick breakfast, Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed into town. As he drove, he scanned the streets for any sign of the SUV, but the roads were quiet. Too quiet. Brooksville had always been a slow-moving town, but today, Marcus felt as though every corner he turned held a secret he wasn't privy to. His first stop was the local diner, where Mrs. Jenkins, the ever-cheerful waitress, always seemed to know everything about everyone. If Sarah had moved to Brooksville recently, Mrs. Jenkins would have heard about it. The familiar bell above the door jingled as Marcus entered the diner. The place was half empty, with only a few regulars scattered around, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. Mrs. Jenkins stood behind the counter, her warm smile greeting him as always. "Well, good morning, Marcus," she called out, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're looking a bit more serious than usual. Everything all right?" Marcus nodded, but his brow furrowed as he walked toward her. "Morning, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm doing okay, but I could use some help." Her smile faltered slightly, concern flashing in her eyes. "Of course, what's on your mind?" "I'm looking for someone," Marcus said, leaning against the counter. "Her name's Sarah Collins. She said she moved to Brooksville a few months ago. Do you know if she's been in here, or maybe heard of her?" Mrs. Jenkins tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Sarah Collins. Collins. Can't say I've heard of her, but that doesn't mean she hasn't passed through here. We get plenty of new folks every now and then." She paused, a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. But wait, there was a woman who came in a few times, real quiet, always sat in the corner by herself. She had that look about her, you know, like she was hiding from something. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. When was this? Maybe a month ago. "Haven't seen her in a couple of weeks, though," Mrs. Jenkins said. She never talked much, just kept to herself, drank her coffee, and left. Could be the same woman you're looking for. Marcus nodded slowly. Did she mention where she was living? Or maybe where she worked? Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. Sorry, Marcus. She wasn't much for small talk. But if she's new in town, you might try checking the property office. They'd have records of anyone who's recently bought or rented a place. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Marcus thanked Mrs. Jenkins and left the diner, his thoughts racing. If Sarah had been laying low in town, it was possible that she hadn't shared much about herself with anyone. That only made the situation more suspicious. What was she hiding from? The property office was located just a few blocks away, a small, unassuming building tucked between the general store and a law office. Marcus parked his truck and walked inside, greeted by the sterile smell of old paper and polished wood. Behind the desk sat Mr. Thompson, a balding man with thick glasses and a permanent scowl. He looked up as Marcus entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What can I do for you?" Mr. Thompson asked, his tone as gruff as ever. "I'm looking for someone who might have moved to town recently," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Her name's Sarah Collins." Thompson grunted, shuffling through a stack of papers on his desk. "We get a lot of people moving in and out these days. Hold on, let me check the records." The seconds felt like hours as Thompson scanned through the files, the only sound in the room, the quiet rustle of paper. Finally, he stopped, his eyes settling on a page. "Here we go," he muttered. Sarah Collins rented a small place over on Cedar Street, right near the edge of town. Moved in about 3 months ago. Marcus leaned forward. "Does it say anything else? Like if she gave a forwarding address?" Thompson shook his head. "Nope, just the rental agreement, but she's still listed as the current tenant." Marcus thanked him and left the office, his mind racing. Cedar Street was on the outskirts of town, a quiet area with only a few houses scattered along the winding road. If Sarah was still living there, he could finally get some answers. As he drove toward Cedar Street, the unease that had been gnawing at him since the previous night began to creep back in. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, like he was stepping into something far bigger than he could handle. But he had no choice. He needed to know what was going on. The houses on Cedar Street were spaced far apart, each one hidden behind tall trees and winding driveways. Marcus slowed his truck as he neared the address listed in the property records. It was a modest house, much like his own, small and unremarkable, with a weathered porch and a garden that had seen better days. But as Marcus pulled into the driveway, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Parked outside the house, partially hidden behind a tree, was the black SUV. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he stared at the vehicle, every nerve in his body screaming that something was wrong. He had been right all along. The SUV was connected to Sarah. But why? And who was inside? For a moment, he considered turning around and leaving. Whatever this was, it wasn't his problem. He had done his good deed, and now it was time to walk away before he got in too deep. But something inside him refused to back down. Marcus had always been a man who helped others, no matter the cost. And if Sarah was in trouble, real trouble, he couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. He parked his truck a short distance from the house, far enough away that he hoped whoever was in the SUV wouldn't notice him. As he approached the house, his steps were slow and cautious, his eyes darting between the front door and the black vehicle. The windows of the SUV were still tinted, making it impossible to see who or what was inside. When he reached the front door, Marcus hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew he had to be prepared for anything. He rang the doorbell, the sound echoing through the stillness of the morning. Seconds passed. No answer. He rang again, louder this time, his pulse quickening as he glanced over his shoulder at the SUV. It was still there, unmoving, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him from inside. Just as Marcus was about to turn away, the door creaked open a few inches, and Sarah's face appeared in the gap. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and surprise as she looked at him. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" Marcus leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." "What's going on, Sarah? Why is that SUV following me? And why are you hiding?" Sarah's eyes darted past him to the SUV, her face paling even more. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled the door open wider, gesturing for him to come inside. "All right," she whispered, "but you're not going to like what you hear." Marcus stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click. As the darkness of the house enveloped him, he realized that whatever answers Sarah had, they were going to come with a price he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. But it was too late to turn back now. The truth, whatever it was, waited just beyond that door, unveiling the past. As Marcus stepped into Sarah's house, the air felt heavier, thicker with an unspoken tension that seemed to cling to every corner. The dimly lit interior was a stark contrast to the sunlight spilling in from outside. The curtains were drawn, casting long shadows across the room, and a silence hung in the air that was almost suffocating. The smell of stale coffee and anxiety lingered, mixing with the faint scent of lavender. Everything about the atmosphere screamed secrecy, like the house itself was hiding something, just as Sarah was. Sarah closed the door softly behind him, her fingers trembling as they brushed the lock into place. Marcus studied her face in the dim light. Her once composed and professional appearance from the night of their roadside encounter had vanished. Her hair, once neat and pulled back into a ponytail, now hung loosely around her shoulders, and dark circles framed her eyes as if she hadn't slept in days. She looked worn down, like someone who had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for far too long. "You shouldn't have come here, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice a whisper, as if she feared even the walls could betray her. Marcus felt a cold pit of dread form in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. He had come this far, and walking away now wasn't an option. He had to know the truth. "I didn't have a choice," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "I've been followed by that SUV ever since I helped you with the tire. I got a message telling me to be careful who I help, and someone left a note on my truck saying I should have taken your money. Now I find the same SUV parked outside your house." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "What's going on, Sarah? What are you not telling me?" Sarah looked away, her gaze flickering toward the floor as if she couldn't bear to meet his eyes. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Marcus could hear the sound of his own heartbeat, pulsing in his ears. Finally, she drew in a deep breath, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the words she was about to speak. "I didn't want to drag anyone else into this," she murmured, "but I guess it's too late now." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Drag anyone into what? What's happening?" Sarah gestured toward the worn couch in the living room, and Marcus took a seat, his senses on high alert. She remained standing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from the truth she was about to reveal. "It started long before I came to Brooksville," Sarah began, her voice quiet but laced with tension. "I used to live in the city, Portland. I worked as an assistant at a law firm, nothing fancy. But one day, about 6 months ago, I got pulled into something I wasn't supposed to see." She paused, her eyes dark with memory. "My boss, the head of the firm, was involved in some shady deals. He had connections to powerful people who operate outside the law, people who use their wealth and influence to manipulate everything around them." Marcus leaned forward, sensing that Sarah's story was about to take a dark turn. "What kind of deals?" "Money laundering, illegal arms deals, even human trafficking," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. "I stumbled across some documents one night while working late. I wasn't supposed to be in the office after hours, but I needed to finish a project. I opened a file I shouldn't have. And when I saw the names, the transactions, I knew I was in over my head." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, The SUV, the warnings, it all made sense now. "You're running from them," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. I tried to stay quiet, to pretend like I hadn't seen anything, but they knew. They always know. I started getting threats, calls from blocked numbers, strange cars following me whenever I left my apartment. I knew if I didn't leave, they'd come for me. "Who are they?" Marcus asked, his voice low, trying to keep his fear at bay. "They call themselves the Collective," Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "It's not just one person or one group. It's a network of powerful people, business leaders, politicians, criminals. They got their hands in everything. And they don't leave loose ends. Once you're on their radar, you're either with them or you're a target." Marcus's mind raced. He'd heard of underground networks like this, whispers of them in news stories, rumors that never made it past speculation. But to hear Sarah describe it with such certainty made it real. And now, by helping her, Marcus had unknowingly crossed into their world. "They've been looking for me ever since I left Portland," Sarah continued, pacing the room. "I changed my name, moved from city to city, trying to stay under the radar. Brooksville seemed like the perfect place to disappear. Quiet, small, off the map. I thought I could lay low here for a while. But I guess they found me." Marcus leaned back on the couch, trying to process everything. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "And the SUV?" he asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. "They're watching me," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'd been watching me for weeks. I didn't know they had started following you too." Marcus clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him. "Why me? I just stopped to help you with your car. Why would they come after me?" "Because they're paranoid," Sarah explained. "They can't risk anyone finding out what they're involved in. For all they know, you could be part of some investigation, or worse, someone who's helping me escape. They don't leave anything to chance, Marcus. Once you're in their sights, they don't stop until they've eliminated the threat." A cold silence fell between them as Marcus absorbed the enormity of what she was saying. This wasn't just about a good deed gone wrong. This was a life-or-death situation. The Collective wasn't going to stop until they silenced both him and Sarah. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but every path seemed to lead to the same dark conclusion. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to make their move." Sarah rubbed her arms, as if trying to warm herself against an invisible chill. "I've been trying to figure that out. I've been living in the shadows for months, always looking over my shoulder, never staying in one place for too long. But now that they found me again, I don't know if I can keep running." "We can't outrun them forever," Marcus said, his voice firm. "But maybe we can fight back. If we can find out who's behind this, expose them, maybe we can turn the tables." Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand, Marcus. These people are untouchable. They've got connections everywhere, in law enforcement, the government, even the media. If we go to the authorities, they'll either cover it up or we'll disappear before we even get a chance to speak." Marcus stood, pacing the room as his mind worked through the options. It was a desperate situation, but he wasn't ready to give up. "There has to be a way," he insisted. "Someone we can trust, someone outside their influence." For the first time since he'd entered the house, Sarah looked up with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "There is one person," she said slowly, "an old friend of mine from Portland. He used to work in cybersecurity, one of the best. If anyone could help us gather evidence without being detected, it's him." Marcus's heart leaped at the possibility. "Where is he?" Sarah hesitated. "The last time I talked to him, he was off the grid, somewhere in the mountains. He told me he was laying low, like me, but he left me a way to contact him in case I ever needed help." "Then we need to find him," Marcus said, his resolve hardening. "If he can help us gather enough evidence to expose the Collective, we might have a chance." Sarah nodded, a flicker of determination crossing her face. "But we need to be careful," she warned. "If they even suspect we're trying to fight back, they'll come down on us harder than ever." Marcus understood the stakes. He had been dragged into a fight he never asked for, but now there was no turning back. If the collective thought they could intimidate him into silence, they were wrong. He had spent his life helping people, and he wasn't about to stop now. But as they began to formulate a plan, neither of them noticed the subtle movement outside. Through the gaps in the curtains, a shadow shifted near the black SUV parked in the driveway. Whoever was watching them hadn't left, and they weren't alone. The real danger was closer than either Marcus or Sarah realized. A dangerous plan. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus and Sarah sat across from each other, a thin veil of determination shrouding their fear. The reality of their situation weighed heavily on both of them. They were no longer just bystanders. They were now targets, and while Marcus had made a habit of fixing things for others, this was a situation that went far beyond anything he had ever encountered. He was in uncharted waters, navigating a world of secrets, power, and danger, and there was no turning back. "We need to contact your friend," Marcus said, his voice steady, though the gravity of the moment gnawed at his insides. "If he can help us gather enough evidence, maybe we can find a way out of this. Maybe there's a way to expose the collective." Sarah nodded, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes, fear that mirrored his own. "I have a secure way to reach him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's risky. I haven't contacted him in months, and I'm not sure if he's still in the same location." Marcus leaned forward. "What do we have to lose? We're already in deep. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets. We have to act now, before they make their move." Sarah hesitated, chewing her lip. "You're right. But if they're watching us, and they almost certainly are, reaching out could tip them off. If they know we're trying to gather evidence, they won't hesitate to shut us down permanently." Marcus nodded, understanding the risk. The collective didn't operate like common criminals. They had resources, connections, and the ability to erase problems without leaving a trace. But Marcus had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when innocent lives were at stake. He had seen enough good people get hurt in his life. He wasn't going to let that happen again. "Let's do it," he said, his tone firm. "We can't keep hiding. If we don't fight back, we'll always be on the run." Sarah stood up, moving toward a small wooden desk in the corner of the room. From one of the drawers, she pulled out an old flip phone, its screen scratched and its buttons worn. She handed it to Marcus. "This is how I used to contact him. It's untraceable, or at least it was the last time I used it. We have to hope they haven't found a way to track this." Marcus took the phone, feeling its weight in his hand. It was strange holding something so outdated in a world that was now so connected. But that was the point. An old device like this could slip under the radar, operating outside the networks the collective might be monitoring. Sarah opened the phone, her fingers moving quickly over the keypad as she typed a short, coded message. She didn't use names or any identifying details, just a simple phrase. "Need help. Urgent. Same location." She hit send and then closed the phone, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it back to Marcus. Now we wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they sat in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. Marcus's eyes flicked toward the window, half expecting to see the SUV still parked outside, but he resisted the urge to check. Whoever was watching them could be waiting for them to slip up, to make a move that revealed their intentions. He couldn't afford to give them that. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the phone buzzed softly in Marcus's hand. The vibration startled them both, breaking the heavy silence that had filled the room. Sarah's eyes widened as Marcus flipped open the phone and read the reply. "Safe. North Cabin. Same precautions." A flood of relief washed over Sarah's face, but it was tempered by the reality of what came next. "He's still in the same place," she said, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. "He has a cabin up in the mountains, completely off the grid. If we can make it there, we'll be safe. For a while at least." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already racing with the logistics of the plan. The mountains were a few hours' drive from Brooksville, and while the area was remote, getting there wouldn't be easy. The collective was watching, and any sudden movements could alert them. They would have to be careful, meticulous even, if they wanted to reach the cabin undetected. "We need to plan this carefully," Marcus said, thinking out loud. "If they're watching your house, they'll notice if we just drive off together. We have to leave separately, maybe stagger our departure times. I'll take my truck, but we'll need to find a way to lose anyone who might be tailing us." Sarah nodded, already processing the details. "There's a road that leads out of town, through the backwoods. It's mostly used by hunters, but it connects with the main highway eventually. We could use that to get out without being seen." Marcus thought about it. It was a good plan, but there were still risks. "All right," he said, standing up. "We'll need supplies, enough to last a few days in case we can't make it to the cabin in one trip. I'll pack some gear, and we'll meet halfway down that back road. Make sure you're not followed." Sarah bit her lip, her mind whirring as she considered the plan. And what about the phone? They might try to track it. Marcus shook his head. "Once we're on the road, we ditch it. We'll only use it to contact him one more time when we're close to the cabin." They both moved with purpose, their adrenaline fueling them as they prepared for the dangerous journey ahead. Marcus left the house first, slipping out the back door to avoid any eyes that might be watching. His truck was parked down the street, hidden behind a row of tall trees that offered some cover. He scanned the road carefully, searching for any sign of the black SUV or other suspicious vehicles, but everything appeared quiet. Too quiet. He got into his truck and started the engine, his hands gripping the wheel as he navigated toward the outskirts of town. His eyes were constantly darting to the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of a tail. The minutes ticked by slowly, each mile feeling longer than the last. About 20 minutes into the drive, just as Marcus thought they might be in the clear, his heart sank. In the distance, he spotted the unmistakable black SUV. It wasn't following him directly, yet, but it was parked at a gas station just off the main road, its tinted windows like eyes, always watching. Marcus kept his cool, forcing himself to stay calm as he passed the gas station without slowing down. Whoever was inside the SUV wasn't in pursuit, but they were close enough to see his truck. He took a deep breath, keeping his speed steady, knowing that if he acted too quickly, it would tip them off. About 10 minutes later, Marcus spotted the turnoff to the backwoods road Sarah had mentioned. It was an old dirt path barely visible from the main road, overgrown with weeds and branches. He slowed down, checking the rearview mirror one last time. The SUV was nowhere in sight. This was it, the first step of their escape. Marcus turned onto the dirt road, his truck bouncing over the uneven ground. The thick trees closed in around him, offering a sense of cover that felt both comforting and claustrophobic. He drove for another 20 minutes, following the winding path deeper into the woods, until he reached a small clearing where they had agreed to meet. Sarah arrived not long after, her car covered in dust from the backroad journey. She stepped out, a backpack slung over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the trees nervously. "Any trouble?" Marcus asked as he walked over to her. "No," Sarah said, though her voice was shaky. "I didn't see anyone following me. What about you?" "I saw the SUV again," Marcus admitted, his voice low. "But they didn't follow me off the main road. I think we're in the clear for now." Sarah's face paled slightly, but she nodded. "Let's not waste any time. The cabin is still a few hours away, and we need to get there before dark." They both climbed into Marcus's truck, Sarah taking the passenger seat as Marcus navigated the rugged terrain. The forest around them grew thicker, the trees towering above like silent sentinels, watching their every move. The drive was tense, each bump in the road jarring their nerves as much as their bodies. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees, making everything feel more ominous. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that even though the SUV hadn't followed them directly, the collective had eyes everywhere. After what felt like an eternity, the dense forest began to thin, and in the distance, Marcus spotted a small weathered cabin nestled between two hills. It was unremarkable, just a simple wooden structure with a tin roof and a few windows, but it represented their only hope for safety. As they pulled up to the cabin, Sarah let out a shaky breath. "We made it," she whispered, though the fear in her eyes told Marcus she knew the danger wasn't over yet. Marcus parked the truck, scanning the area around them. Everything was still, too still. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had been followed, that someone or something was out there, watching them from the trees. "We're here," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "Now let's see if your friend can help us." But just as they stepped out of the truck, a sound echoed through the woods, a sharp crack, like the snapping of a branch underfoot. Marcus froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. They weren't alone. The real battle was just beginning. Into the lion's den. The sharp crack of a branch echoed ominously through the thick forest, freezing Marcus and Sarah in their tracks. The world seemed to hold its breath for a long, tense moment. The shadows of the trees stretched menacingly across the ground as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, plunging the woods into an eerie twilight. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. His instincts, honed from a lifetime of knowing when something was off, screamed at him that they were no longer alone. Whoever, or whatever, had followed them wasn't far behind. He exchanged a quick, tense glance with Sarah, her face pale with fear. He could see it in her eyes. She was wondering if they had made a terrible mistake by coming here. But there was no time for second-guessing. "We need to get inside," Marcus whispered, his voice steady but urgent. He was already scanning the trees for movement, for the flicker of something unnatural among the shadows. "Now." Sarah nodded, her eyes darting toward the cabin. Together, they moved quickly but cautiously, their footsteps barely audible over the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet. The old wooden structure loomed ahead, its weathered timbers blending into the landscape like a forgotten relic from another time. As they reached the porch, Marcus took one last look at the tree line, scanning for any sign of movement. But the woods remained still, silent. Too silent. He pushed open the cabin door, the hinges creaking in protest, and motioned for Sarah to enter first. She slipped inside, and Marcus followed, closing the door behind them as quietly as he could. The cabin's interior was just as rustic as the exterior. Bare, wooden walls, a small fireplace, and minimal furnishings. It was a place designed for one purpose: isolation. But that isolation, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for some time, but there was a sense of preparedness in the way things had been left behind. A few old supplies sat on the shelves: canned food, matches, a lantern. But the real prize was a small locked metal case sitting on a rickety table in the center of the room. Sarah rushed toward the case, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the key in her pocket. Marcus stood by the window, peering out through a crack in the old, moth-eaten curtains. The shadows of the trees seemed to shift and dance in the dying light, playing tricks on his mind. He swore he could feel eyes on them, watching from somewhere just beyond the darkness. "Got it," Sarah said, her voice a harsh whisper as the lock on the metal case clicked open. She lifted the lid, revealing an array of neatly packed electronic equipment, small, sleek devices that looked far too advanced for a place as remote as this. "What is all this?" Marcus asked, stepping away from the window and glancing over her shoulder. "Surveillance and encryption gear," Sarah explained, her fingers flying over the equipment as she set it up. "My friend Aaron left it here for emergencies. It's designed to keep us off the grid, at least for a while. We can communicate securely with him, and start gathering the evidence we need to expose the collective without them tracking us. Marcus nodded, impressed but uneasy. Will it be enough? It has to be, Sarah replied, her voice tight with determination. Once we send the data to Aaron, he can start piecing together a case. But we need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the greater the risk they'll find us. Just as Sarah finished setting up the equipment, a series of beeps emitted from one of the devices, signaling that it had connected to a secure network. Sarah typed furiously, sending encrypted messages to Aaron with the details of their situation. Marcus stood guard by the window, his eyes never leaving the tree line. After what felt like an eternity, the device pinged again, and a message appeared on the screen. Received. We'll start compiling evidence. Be careful. They're close. Marcus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Aaron's message was a stark reminder of the danger they were in. He turned to Sarah. We need to stay ahead of them. Do you have any idea how long before they catch up? Sarah shook her head, her expression grim. Not long. They have resources we can't even imagine. If they know we're here, it's only a matter of time before they close in. Marcus's mind raced. They couldn't just sit here and wait to be hunted down. They needed a plan, something that would give them the upper hand. But what? They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with virtually limitless power. For the first time, Marcus felt the weight of the situation crushing down on him, the hopelessness of it all. But then, like a flicker of light in the darkness, an idea began to form. We can't run forever, Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. But maybe we don't have to. Sarah looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Marcus stepped away from the window and began pacing the room, the wheels in his mind turning faster and faster. The collective. They're used to people running, hiding. That's what they expect. But if we flip the script, if we go on the offensive, they won't see it coming. Sarah frowned, still not following. How do we go on the offensive against people like them? We're just two people. We don't have their resources. Marcus stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of determination and desperation. We don't need their resources. We just need to draw them out. They're already watching us, right? They're probably closing in as we speak. If we can lure them into a trap, we might have a chance to expose them. A trap? Sarah echoed, her voice skeptical. You think we can trap the collective? Marcus nodded. We make them think they've got us cornered, make them feel safe, and then we hit them where it hurts. Sarah shook her head, still doubtful. And what if they're too strong? What if they see through it? They might, Marcus admitted, his voice grim. But what other choice do we have? We can't keep running. If we stay on the defensive, they'll hunt us down eventually. But if we can catch just one of them, get them to slip up, maybe we can gather enough evidence to force their hand. Sarah bit her lip, thinking it over. The plan was risky, borderline suicidal, but she could see the logic in it. They were out of options. All right, she said slowly. How do we set the trap? Marcus moved to the table, his mind working quickly as he laid out the plan. We know they're tracking us. They'll be expecting us to run, so we make them think we're still trying to escape. We leave a trail, something that leads them to a location where we can control the situation, a place with limited escape routes. Once they're there, we expose them. We make them slip up, catch them on tape, something we can use as leverage. Sarah nodded, her mind racing to keep up. But we'll need a place where we can set the trap. Marcus thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up. There's an old quarry not far from here, about an hour's drive. It's isolated, and there's only one way in and out. If we can get them to follow us there, we might have a chance. Sarah's face paled. That sounds dangerous. What if they have more people? What if they're armed? They will be, Marcus said, his tone grim. But if we control the terrain, we'll have the advantage. And we're not trying to take them all down. We just need enough to expose them. It was a long shot, But Sarah could see that Marcus believed in it, and after everything they'd been through, she knew they didn't have any better options. She swallowed hard, nodding. "All right, let's do it." Marcus and Sarah spent the next hour preparing, gathering supplies, and planning their route to the quarry. They packed the surveillance equipment, a camera, and anything they could use to document the encounter. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. As they loaded the truck and prepared to leave the cabin, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The shadows in the trees seemed to be watching them, growing longer with every passing second. Finally, they set off, driving through the thick woods toward the quarry. The sun had fully set now, and the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. The road was rough and narrow, and every bump in the path made Marcus's heart race. They were heading straight into the lion's den, and there was no turning back. As they neared the quarry, Marcus slowed the truck, turning off the headlights as they approached the clearing. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of their breathing seemed too loud in the stillness. They parked the truck just out of sight and set up the surveillance equipment, positioning the camera where it could capture the entrance to the quarry. "We're ready," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible in the dark. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Now we wait." They didn't have to wait long. Not 10 minutes after they had set the trap, the sound of an engine echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable sight of headlights cutting through the darkness. The black SUV. Marcus's pulse quickened as the vehicle slowly rolled into the quarry, its occupants still hidden behind the tinted windows. It came to a stop in the center of the clearing, the engine idling as if waiting for something. Marcus and Sarah exchanged a tense glance, their hearts pounding in unison. The trap was set, but what came next was anyone's guess. They had the evidence they needed. The camera was rolling, capturing everything. But would it be enough? And more importantly, would they survive the night? The door to the SUV opened, and a figure stepped out, their silhouette barely visible in the darkness. Marcus strained his eyes, trying to make out the details, but the shadows obscured the figure's face. Whoever they were, they moved with purpose, their steps steady and controlled. Marcus's hand tightened around the small flashlight he carried. He knew they were about to come face to face with the enemy, and there was no telling how this would end. The figure stopped just a few feet from where Marcus and Sarah were hidden, their voice cutting through the night like a blade. "You should have stayed hidden, Marcus." The game was over. But Marcus wasn't done fighting. Not yet.